sometime over this summer, when I was asked to give this talk, I started to look at the guidelines, and everything seemed pretty straightforward until I got to the frequently asked questions. The first question was, do I have to be an expert? I thought to myself, of course not. There are very few experts in this world. I am certainly not one. They can't expect me to be one. You know where this is going. Wrong. Yes, you are expected to be an expert in your field. So I panicked. I panicked. And then I turned to my only foolproof solution to a panic moment, and that is a very long run. And on that run, I started to scroll through my slideshow of life, digging deep for that inner expert. The run got longer. And sure, I was a fine student athlete, went to a fine university where I was captain of the track team and even set track records in 800 meters, whatever that was. But I was coached by the experts. Sure, I was a fine school leader and a middle school teacher, but I learned from those experts. And today, my husband and I do a fine-ish job of raising our 3 little people. But in that arena, I most certainly was guided by the expert, my own mother, fondly called Nature Lady by our friends because of the healthy, earthy, crunchy meals that she tried out on them. So today, expert or no expert, I stand here as someone, as Deborah said, who dares to dive in. And I want to talk to you about the power of taking risk. So I started wellness in the schools because I saw firsthand the impact of poor diet and lack of physical activity on children's ability to learn. Simple. I was a young school leader, and I had the task daily of breakfast duty and lunch duty. So I would stand in the cafeteria for breakfast in the morning and watched as children walked into school with a bottle of soda, usually this big, usually orange, and a bag of chips, also this big, also usually orange. This breakfast would soon be followed by an overly processed school lunch, the kind of food that we were hearing about. This was provided by our government. And since 99% of the children in this school qualified for free or reduced lunch, this was possibly the only hot meal that they were going to get that day. So not only did they have orange fingers and orange tongues for a good part of their day, they could not walk a flight of stairs without stopping to catch their breath. They couldn't focus in class. This was the mid-90s, and not too many people were talking about the childhood obesity epidemic. It was certainly not in the headlines. But I was staring at it right in the face. And I knew I had to do something. I knew it was time to dive in. At the time, I didn't quite understand the enormity of the task, but I took it on with the attitude that I do most things in life, hopefully not this, that done is better than perfect. And that has been a bit of the mantra for wellness in the schools, as today we stand at the forefront of the fight against childhood obesity. We just have to dive in. And then we adapt our programming as we see the needs and the impact that we're making. So I admit there were a few mistakes made along the way in those early days of just diving in. But I do believe it's how wellness in the schools grew from one little class of 16 children to now serving over 30,000 children across 3 states in this country. And if in the beginning we felt that we had to be the experts, we probably would have done nothing at all. So consider those early days when we were just practicing. I was still working at a school, a new school. I was an administrator at PS 225 in Manhattan. My daughter, Sadie, was actually in a 3-year-old program there. Sadie, together with the principal's daughter, and 14 other 3-year-olds born to teenage moms attending high school in the building. So I thought, perfect, 16 kids, interesting diversity. The principal was on board, so I decided to practice and provide them healthier lunches. I called upon favors from my friends Joy Pearson and Bart Portenza from Candle Cafe. the wonderful organic vegan farm-to-table restaurant in Manhattan, and from the twins, Mickey and Radha Agrawal, who had just started Slice Pizza, a healthy pizza joint. So they delivered. They came through. We had Candle Cafe one day a week, Slice Pizza on Pizza Friday, and the other 3 days, we had a volunteer chef working in a makeshift kitchen, preparing homemade meals from scratch. Sounds perfect. Well, every few weeks, the volunteer would find a paying job, which I was happy for. But I'd only raised a little bit of money, so I found myself in April of that year, 9 months pregnant, trying to get the baked pieces of chicken out of the oven and couldn't fit between the oven door, the open oven door, and the back of the makeshift kitchen. So you get the picture. So we learned that this was not very sustainable. We also learned that what we were doing, we learned this at the end of the year, was against all Department of Education health and safety regulations. And that in feeding 16 of the nearly 900,000 children that are fed in New York City, we were no example. We were not a replicable model. But we dove in, and we got the attention of the Department of Education, and they, today, 6 years later, are our most important advocates, our best collaborators, as together we are feeding healthier lunches for children in New York. They created the alternative menu. It's a primarily scratched cooked menu for all the schools that we work in. So we use the alternative menu. We have a salad bar. We have homemade salad dressings. We learned about the enormity of the task, and we started to put some structure to our work. And we never would have learned a thing if we didn't just dive in. The space I work in is actually quite small, and I am very fortunate to, in this journey, get to know the most amazing warriors, visionaries, and risk takers. They all are fighting against the childhood obesity epidemic. They all are working to undo 30 years of unhealthy patterns. They all dive in. And they dive with confidence, I believe, because of the following 3 traits. Number 1, I could turn this off. Know your skill set. More importantly, know what you don't know. Well, I'd like to think that I'm famous amongst my children's friends for my kale chips. And when I was in high school, I wanted to start a chocolate chip cookie company. I am no chef. Enter Chef Bill Telepan. So it's the following year. We're now working in 3 schools, 2 in northern Manhattan in high-income communities, in low-income communities, high poverty areas, and 1 PS 87, which is Bill's daughter Leah's. She was in 1st grade at the time. My daughter Sadie had now graduated to pre-K, and she was also in this school. And I feel incredibly fortunate back then and even still today that we can use my children's school as a testing ground. And we learn a great deal from the school administration and from the parents. How my children feel about it is probably a whole other talk. There we were at PS 87 working with a wonderfully progressive school food manager. And we were developing healthier lunches for the kids. And we decided that we were going to showcase those lunches at the parent-teacher conferences in November. I'm getting back to Bill. So there I was, all dolled up in my hairnet and my rubber gloves for the HACCP and my plastic apron, when in walked Upper West Side 3-star chef Bill Telepan. He comes over, he takes a chicken Caesar wrap, he goes into Leah's conference, and on his way back out, he came over to me. I could feel the purple coming into my face. He asked me a few questions, and then he asked how he could help. So, and I know, I can guarantee that it was not the chicken Caesar wrap that lured Bill in. There I am in my apron. It's because Chef Bill Telepan dares to dive in. I can also tell you, at that time, he knew nothing. He was no expert in navigating the largest school system in this country, but he dove. He asked the question, how can I help? And I asked him a few years later what made him stick with this. You know, he was volunteering with us. He had his own job, his own night job, and which had challenges of its own, I'm sure. He said to me, I have one skill. I have always wanted to make a difference in this world. You have given me a platform to use my one skill. So with that, athlete, educator, met chef, and we were on our way. That's why today we send coaches onto the recess yard to get the least active kids active. They structure the recess yard and they play with kids. We send chefs into the kitchens. They train the school food workers on implementing this alternative scratch-cooked menu. They also cook in the classroom with children the same recipes that they're eating in the cafeteria. You cook it, you will eat it. So the concept is healthy lunch, healthy recess, back to school, back to class, ready to learn. Long term, we're teaching them lessons for a lifetime of good health. That was number one. Number two, think big. If you're going to dive in, it's got to be a big splash. When we started Wellness in the Schools, our goal was certainly not to just feed 16 kids healthier lunches. Our goal was that all children across this country in public schools would be eating healthier lunches and playing more positively on the recess yards. I maintain that schools are not the root of this problem, but they can and should be the place for solution. They need to be an example for good health, as they are for everything else. And children spend a majority of their time in schools. We have a captive audience of kids and their parents. And in low-income communities, children get up to as much as 51% of their daily intake, calorie intake, from the National School Lunch Program. So we still think big. That alternative, scratched-cooked, healthier menu is only in 50 of the 1,400 schools in New York City. But I see a way for that menu to be the norm for all children and not just an alternative for few. It's going to happen. And thinking big in our space, there is none other than Tony LaCorey. The changes in school lunch across this country are because of Tony's work. We're doing what we do because of Tony's work. She's a pioneer in this work, and I think we can probably even call her an expert. She started Cookshop in 1994 and now runs School Food Focus. She started that in 2008, and School Food Focus leverages the procurement power of the largest districts in this country so that they can come together and buy more sustainable, more healthy foods at better costs, at lower costs. It's because of Tony's work that in Chicago, you'll be happy to hear this, children are eating locally raised, antibiotic-free chicken for lunch. And it's because of Tony's work that so many others are following. Excuse me. Thank you, Tony, for thinking big. Point number 3, sweat equity. This is my last and possibly the most resonating point for wellness in the schools. People make mistakes. People fail. People are messy. People and organizations learn from those mistakes and grow from those mistakes. Sophisticated spreadsheets and fancy systems probably don't. We have our goals, and we actually have those fancy systems and spreadsheets now too. But we rely on people, on sweat equity. A cook and a coach go into a school with a mission. They connect with that school. They adapt as they need. They listen. They smile. They share their own personal stories. They listen to the stories of others. We rely deeply on those human connections because the schools must trust. The schools must own their own change, and they only can do that if they connect with our change agents. People talking to people is really only how change can happen. And the people who work for wellness in the schools embody our principles. They have a skill set. They dare to think big with us. And they sweat, literally, every day in those hot kitchens and on the recess yards with the children. And talking about sweat equity, I also want to mention Tony Hillary in Harlem Grown. I met Tony in 2011 when we started working at PS 175 in Harlem. Tony actually brought us there. Before Harlem Grown, Tony was running a fancy limousine company, driving the New York City celebrities and stars. And here's how he tells me his story. I wake up one day, my cars are paid for, my mortgage is paid for, my children have a college education. So he sells his cars, all but for one, for the fancy clients, the fanciest of fancy clients. And he decides to build gardens in his home neighborhood of Harlem and bring access and knowledge about healthy food to children in Harlem. He probably wasn't an expert in building gardens when he started. But today, if you visit a garden, there's Tony, working with the children, interfacing with the schools, sweating every day. We face a very serious childhood obesity epidemic. In the last 30 years, the obesity rates among children have tripled. In this country, 30% of our adults are obese. That's heart disease, that's diabetes, and it goes on. From 1985, when I was just entering college, until recently, those are our obesity rates. If we continue to feed children the way we're feeding them, and if we continue to take away opportunities for play in school and everywhere, this will be the first generation of children who will not outlive their parents. If we continue to feed children the way we're feeding them and continue to take away opportunities for play, 1 out of every 3 children in this country will develop diabetes. And that's 1 in 2 minority children. We spend $147 billion on obesity-related illnesses every year in this country. We can't stand by and watch. We've got to dive in. So I'm my mother's daughter. I was raised in a healthy home. But although she kept an organic, uncertified garden and even raised chicken until the possum ate them in the suburbs of Miami, we did grow up like most children in our generation, like Deborah was saying. We ran around outside and played all day. Then we came home to a homemade meal, not fancy, but real food, clean food. We ate that dinner, or that meal, at a table, not in front of a screen, not in a car. That's just what most kids did. So today, we are working against 30 years of processed food and factory farming and, the video game craze. But from where I stand, in the short time I've been doing this work, I see that the tides are turning. Our First Lady, Michelle Obama, is championing the cause against childhood obesity with her Let's Move campaign. People like Jamie Oliver are bringing this issue to the attention of billions of Americans via the television screen and talks like this one. And a recent study shows us that in 40 states tested, 19 of them are starting to go the other direction on obesity rates among children. But this is not enough. Long gone are the days when my brothers and sister and I were running around outside and playing. But the momentum is in our favor, and we must use this momentum to continue to dive in and for more people to dive with us. People often ask me what they can do, and here's what I say. Go have lunch with your child at school, or go eat in a public school. Go play on the recess yard. You may be very happy with what you see, and you can share hopeful and positive stories about the National School Lunch Program and about the impact of great recess on the ability to learn. On the other hand, you may be disappointed. Do something. Dive in. You don't have to be an expert. The consequence of not diving in, the consequence of doing nothing, is the status quo. And our children just can't afford the status quo. Thank you.